Okay, welcome to this webinar on the challenges that West Africa is currently facing. My name is Peter Albrecht, and with me I have two guests. The one is Kwesi Anning. He's a research director and professor at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, and he's been visiting researcher here at DIIS for 3 months, the last 3 months. And with him is Christian Edinger, who is the Sahel coordinator and team leader for West Africa in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs department for West Africa. So the idea behind this seminar is to discuss some of the challenges that West Africa is facing, framed by how Denmark supports the region. This means that the webinar has a strong edge of policy relevance from the perspective of a donor like Denmark, among many others, of course, with responses from one of the key experts on security-related and other matters in the region, which is Kwesi Anning. We will, of course, be discussing the challenges that the region is facing, but also focus on some of the ways that these challenges might be mitigated and the best ways to do that. And we have two excellent sort of guests here that will be able to discuss this in a good way. Beyond that, I also want to just emphasize one of what I call my pet peeves, namely to insist on discussing West Africa as an interconnected region. There is a tendency to talk about particular areas in isolation. Currently, all eyes are on the Sahel, as they were on the West Coast in the 1990s with Liberia, wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Yet the connection between them, historically, politically, and economically, is it's very clear. This means that the problems of the Sahel are the problems of the neighbors of the region, of the neighbors to the south, and should be treated as such. So just these very few words. I just want to briefly sort of outline the program. So first, Kwesi will be doing a short introduction to some of the challenges and also some of the resolutions that for West Africa. This is followed by a discussion between Christian and Kwesi, led by Christian, based on some of the priorities that they have in the foreign ministry. And then we will take questions from the audience for half an hour, or a little bit more depending on how many good questions you have for the two speakers. So without further ado, I just want to give the word to Kwesi. So.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And Christian, it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation again. I think this is about the 5th or 6th in the last couple of years.
Never ended.
So, yes, yeah. So good. So I want to do about 3 things. One, to make a set of prefatory remarks that should locate the conversation that we are going to have. And then secondly, to talk about what I perceive to be the broad challenges faced by both the Sahel and West Africa. But Peter, I like your point about the interconnectedness, precisely because, and I'll make this argument quite strongly, and it's good Peter is here, we cannot begin to understand and to find solutions to the challenges faced by the Sahel and West Africa or the Guinea coast without also seeing the interconnections based on family, politics, social networks, trade, and the others. Then the third part of my 10 minutes of glory will focus on a few resolution type suggestions. So let me make 4 clear prefatory remarks. There is a tendency in all my 40 years of experience when one talks about the challenges in the sub-region to be characterized as a pessimist. My argument is very clear. Being bold and daring about the challenges that the region faces, for me, is about 1/3 of the way towards finding the solution. So I think we have to be bold enough to discuss the challenges in a bold way. 2 relates to what I call as a perfect storm. 20 years ago, there was a lot of optimism in the Sahel and the West African sub-region. Mali was perceived as the most the most democratizing state. Liberia war had ended, likewise Sierra Leone, Guinea, La Côte d'Ivoire. There was a certain optimism. Now that has changed. And I think the threat that we are facing now, or West Africa and the Sahel are facing, also relates to a certain community resilience. Because looked at on the surface, quite a number of those states ought to have collapsed. But there's a certain resilience that keeps them going, albeit slowly, with a lot of pain and trouble. So probably understanding the resilience and what makes these countries tick might be a way of looking at the solutions. But it's also critical that in finding solutions, I would argue strongly, and here I think this is where Christian, the conversations will be quite interesting. I argue strongly that those conversations towards solutions must be located within domestic processes. And I'm focusing on the domestic first before our international partners and friends come in, because that is where the sustainability lies. Long-term, sustainable, stakeholder buy-in. Finally, it's as I head towards pension and my old age, there's something that has fascinated me all my life, and I think I want to, bring it back into the work that I do. The role and centrality of women in ensuring that conflicts can be resolved when they occur or they can be prevented. So let me talk very briefly or mention about 5 or 6 key issues that I think we need to look at. In talking about West Africa and the Sahel, there is no doubt at all that issues of extremism and terrorist violence will continue to play a role for quite a long time to come. Now, that might sound quite harsh, but if one looks very critically at what is happening, there's no doubt that this is a problem that is going to be there. The armies of the sub-region are underfunded, poorly trained, demotivated, and increasingly finding it quite attractive to begin to turn their guns against central government. Second relates to the southward trend or the southward expansion towards the Guinea coast. So we see Burkina Faso almost totally encircled, quite a number of the Guinea coast states beginning to strengthen their boundaries as there's this fear and uncertainty. But I think, Christian, we also need to understand the interest and the smart messaging that is coming from these extremists, and the particular messaging that is tapping into pastoralist populism. How the farmer herder crisis that we see is being exploited in multiple ways, and a narrative of victimhood, of dispossession, and of exclusion is leading to their ability to mobilize. But we're also seeing a shift in terms of the geographical frontiers, new alliances, new defections, and strengthening social networks. So we need to understand who these groups are, their messaging, their alliances, much better to say, how do we protect and prevent communities from being attacked? The second potential challenge that I think one needs to highlight relates to the rather disturbing, unfortunate development of third-termism, deliberate manipulative processes of tinkering with constitutional orders, and the limitations on presidential rule. We've seen it in Guinea, we've seen it in La Côte d'Ivoire, it's happening in Benin, and I think it's leading to tensions and social strains in quite a number of these countries. And I think by tweaking these constitutions, the political elites of the Sahel and West Africa do not seem to understand and appreciate the shifts and the ebbs and flows of the demographic shifts and changes that are taking place. So we are seeing riots in Guinea, in La Côte d'Ivoire. The coup d'etat in Mali was actually a social coup d'etat. Okay, massive forces saying we will not tolerate this type of governance. We've seen in Nigeria the End SARS movement, in which hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of young people took to the streets, challenging the authority of the state and the government to say things must end and be done, or things must change so that governance brings about better social welfare goods. So we need to look at the manner in which these regions are governed, the role of the youthful population. So let me leave it at that. The third issue I want to talk about is what my friend Peter always teases me, that is very sensitive, and only I can talk about it. It relates to the demographics. Both the Sahel and West African states are increasing in terms of their populations at such an astronomical rate that there needs to be a conversation about how to link those high figures to the state's ability to provide jobs, to provide education, to provide housing, and to provide protection. Closely related to the expanding demographics is also expanding urban spaces, unplanned, ungoverned, and increasingly with very limited law enforcement. Now, with massive population growth, of course, this relationship is at best very tenuous, but we are seeing climate change. Probably this is where African governments themselves have not contributed too much to. But that change is shifting and impacting on multiple aspects of people's livelihood. First relates to migratory trends. One part of it moving up north, and we are seeing, Fortress Europe being stronger and stronger. Probably it may be even more difficult for me to come here, maybe next year. But we are seeing a much more disturbing, socially tense migratory patterns leading down south, where communities that are already challenged in terms of their food security, in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of access to potable water, now have pastoralist groups and other groups moving into their communities. Okay, so we are seeing already fragile ecosystems being destroyed, leading to more and more tensions. Now, in both the Sahel and West Africa, this is characterized as the farmer herder crisis. This is a crisis that on quite a number of levels is looked at in a very narrow sense. But I think were we to follow, Peter's admonition and look at the interconnectedness of seemingly individual, independent, totally disconnected phenomena as interlinked, then we will begin to see a larger picture that creates quite some challenges for us. Two last points. The tensions that I'm talking about, the challenges, these challenges are there. But the easy availability of small arms and light weapons, now it's not very fashionable to talk about small arms and light weapons anymore. But from where I sit and the crime statistics that I look at, these crimes are getting more violent. More societies are living in fear precisely because of the availability of these arms across the sub-region that we are talking about. Now, most people are saying, oh, it was because Mr. Gaddafi was killed, his armories were opened, and therefore these guns flooded into Sahel and to West Africa. That is lazy scholarship. West Africa has had two dynamics. First, the easy accessibility and use and abuse of end user certificates to import guns into the sub-region. And secondly, the deepening sophistication of the local manufacturer. Gaddafi's armories only came to compound an already existing problem. My final point, or at least final introductory point, relates to maritime insecurity. More often than not, maritime insecurity is perceived as crimes that happen on the high seas and therefore does not really affect the challenges that we have on land. Maritime insecurity, or piracy as it's popularly called, is only land-based crimes that are happening at sea. And we are seeing the deepening interconnectedness once more, thanks to Peter, between what happens on the high seas and what I classify as the piracy stock exchanges that we are beginning to see dotting around the Gulf of Guinea coast. That the goods, the maps, the oil, and the issues related to insurance of these ships are closely related to governance issues and insecurity issues on land. The essence of this conversation for me relates to how we begin a process of finding, solutions or some answers to these challenges. So the last minutes that I have, most certainly we would need to ask some very tough questions. To what extent can the state, as the engine for growth and development and the provision of security over time, continue to play that individual role without looking into itself and its communities to say, what are the strengths of the communities? And do we need to change the manner in which security is provided, in which justice is provided, and who are the critical actors who would have to sit around the table? And for me, once more, we would need to look at traditional authorities, but most certainly the women who ensure that livelihoods continue irrespective of the challenges and the dangers that their communities face. So Peter, let me leave my introductory remarks here.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. I won't say anything apart from say you're welcome to question 2.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to you, Kwesi, for this introduction, and also from my side, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss some of the many challenges that we do face in West Africa and in the Sahel. Just to mention one that you didn't mention is, for instance, the effects of climate change and how that plays into the farmer herder tension and so forth. Many of the things you have highlighted, the demographic growth, the weak institutions, and the how do you say that, the lack of willingness of the political elite to see what is at stake is obviously something that we do take into our consideration ourselves, and what we are kind of struggling to find the answers to. Maybe just for some in the audience that do not know exactly what Denmark has of presence in West Africa, I think it's fair to say that we have an embassy in Mali and in Burkina Faso, and we have one in Accra and one in Nigeria. So this is the point of departure, so to speak, for our presence in West Africa. And in terms of our engagement in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, we have large-scale development programs, whereas in Ghana, we did have a development program, but we do not have it anymore, and we have never had that in Nigeria. while we only opened the embassy back in 14. Our approach to our work and engagement in the Sahel is what we call the integrated approach, a holistic approach, where we try to combine the different instruments we have at our disposal in the region. And that is a combination of the development aid, the long term. It is also the humanitarian assistance, and then the security part, which can both be on the civil side and on the military side. Being a smaller country for Denmark, partnerships are extremely important. Partnerships, obviously, with the countries and the organizations in the region, but also with our international partners. And that leads me maybe to my first question to you, because we have seen, some would call that a proliferation of initiatives, especially in the Sahel, both on development, the Sahel Alliance, on security. We have the Partnership for Stability and Security in the Sahel, and we have the Sahel Coalition as the last. Now, you underline the need for building all this and basing all our engagement on the domestic national processes. How do you see that link, if any, between these more local national processes and the international initiatives of which Denmark is an active partner?
No, Christian, I think this is an old boogie in all forms of international, partnerships. How can external partners identify critical stakeholders who enjoy the credibility, both at the local and at the national levels, to be able to partner them? And how can one select these partners in a manner that central government does not feel bypassed? And how can one extend partnerships to local communities through governments or central governments who may not necessarily enjoy the credibility of local societies? So, these are very difficult, tricky operational issues, but I think they are issues that we need to find a way to deal with. One critical stakeholder that all central governments cannot overlook, and once more I'll come to the issue of women's groups, for example. In Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ghana, and probably even in Nigeria, I think women's agency is beginning to be recognized and respected as critical stakeholders, both in the security side, which until recently nobody wanted to talk about, but more so in the developmental side. And I think without having gone into the specifics, we want to look at the development projects that you have invested in and what role women's groups can play. I don't have any doubt at all that they ought to be and can be, very critical stakeholders. On the security side, once more, women's groups can play a key role in the provision of justice, but also in deepening peace. They may not necessarily be provided with any training to understand extremism and to prevent extremism. But were we to ask these communities, what is it that makes you fear? How can you contribute, or how can external partners support the activities that you engage in to bring about a sense of stability so that you can go about your daily activities. I think we would get all sorts of fascinating answers that can contribute to strengthening these partnerships and these coalitions. Unfortunately, there is such an emphasis on the military aspects or sending support, training, basic equipment to statutory forces, that sometimes we actually overlook the non-military aspects of the interventions that we need to make. I mean, some of the work that we've done in Mali and some of my colleagues in Burkina Faso and in Niger certainly does strengthen the points that I am making. So I think one is to look at what can be done slightly differently. But sometimes it doesn't actually cost that much, money, because these women are those who are at the forefront in keeping the communities, households when men go out to fight and also when they come back home. So probably we need to start looking at how we can identify and support some of these groups.
But this, if I understand you correctly, the focus on the military side, which seems to be too strong, something that is a recurrent remark that we often get, I think, and I think from our side and from how we see the work and the approach of the international initiatives, I think there's, like, from my point of view, a clear recognition that you have to walk on both legs, on the military side as well as on the non-military side, development, humanitarian assistance, and so forth. And I mean, I cannot resist it just to quote Kofi Annan, in the sense that there is no development without security, and there is no security without development. And I think it is at the core of our approach. That's one thing, and the other one obviously is that, I mean, we can only support to the extent that the local governments and local stakeholders, that they kind of take that responsibility themselves. I think that's also a key issue in our approach. That's how it works. You have not mentioned in your introduction this that we are facing a series of elections in the region, in the countries of the region. Just on Sunday, we have one coming up in Burkina Faso. There, we do not have the third term issue, at least yet. Maybe you can say something about that. But what seems to be a quite calm situation in the country, but we will have to see that. But for me, the question is, do you see any what's the word that you researchers use, embryonic elements for going in the direction that you would like the countries to go, and that we could then partner up with from the international side? Are there any hopes, to put it a little simple that way?
Well, let me start with your usage of the word hope. And I think that is what I started with, identifying the challenges that these countries face. For me, it's a first step towards saying, look, we recognize these challenges, we want to do something about them, and please don't write us off, that there's a willingness and a preparedness to do something. I spoke about the demographics. On the surface, they look disturbing, frightening, huge numbers of young people, quasi-educated, plugged into a globalized world, a sense of exclusion from the politics and economic growth, leading to a potential sense of hopelessness. But can we turn this round? How do we engage these teeming, populations of young people, dynamic, and create opportunities and avenues for them to use that dynamism to bring about some levels of transformation? Now, when you live in patriarchal societies where the leadership of most of these states are gerontocratic, probably almost every leader in West Africa is close to 70 or above 70 years. More often than not, the connect and the understanding about what drives young people, and here I'm talking about people between the ages of 18 to 35, sometimes 40 years, that's classified as young. Okay, can we harness the potential in these groups and then turn it around? So I think therein lies the potential for hope. But that ability to harness that potential is also predicated on leadership, on nuanced leadership that is humble enough, that is knowledgeable enough, and prepared to say, well, we need to hand the baton to younger people equally well educated. I think I mentioned in passing the challenges of all these electoral processes, Benin, Guinea, and La Côte d'Ivoire. Yes, Burkina Faso is happening. We haven't had a third term. Ghana happening in about 2.5 weeks. It has never been on the agenda. Niger will happen on the 31st of December, I think. Probably, Burkina Faso will have a successful elections, but a successful election under considerable strain. And I think for Burkina Faso, there's a need for the elections to be successful. Otherwise, it will just be one more step, towards its collapse. Ghana's elections certainly are tense. The narratives are highfalutin with lots of emotions and noise, but I believe very strongly that that one will also pass. Probably there may be some challenges. There may be a legal challenge. There's been some problems with the voter registration process. The opposition has some disturbances or has some criticisms. I think Niger's election, similar to Burkina Faso's, is being held in a very tense situation. So though we see some reversals in our democratic strides, there is still a basis for hope. And let me make this point very clearly. Positive growth and development and security or stability do not come on a silver platter. There are contestations of ideas. Sometimes they can get a little bit tense and sometimes not. But within that locus of contestation about those ideas, states always find a way to move in a positive direction. So if you look at West Africa, even though Guinea and La Côte d'Ivoire have changed their constitutions, there's been a coup d'etat in Mali, the brutalities in Nigeria are totally unacceptable. This is the first time in West Africa's history that all the presidents are democratically elected. Now, that creates a space for civil society to engage, and that certainly creates an opportunity for our international partners also to engage with civil society, because there's an increasing tolerance of the role that civil society plays, but certainly also about the epistemic expertise that they bring to the table. And I think in Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, La Côte d'Ivoire, and in Ghana, and certainly in Senegal, one sees a more diverse, but also very strong civil society groups that engages with their government.
You refer to the youth and as one of the key actors for maybe achieving change in in a positive way. Don't you think? And that I mean, when we engage with youth, and we have quite a lot of experience by now in the Sahel countries with this. It's also important to note that it is a heterogeneous group. It's, I mean, in terms of a group opposite to the political elite, yes, but it's also a very nuanced group in itself. So I would like to maybe have your views on that, and also on picking a bit on what is happening without drawing too many parallels, but what we are seeing on the Horn and in Ethiopia, and this ethnic dominated conflict we have, and to what extent that is already playing and could be playing an increasing role in the tensions on one hand, but also with regard to constructing a national and political project for the West African countries.
Well, let me start with the Horn. And I like the manner that you couched it, constructing a national project. If you look at most African countries in the early 60s and late 1950s, I mean, these were diverse groups brought together by the colonial processes, who didn't know each other, have gone to war against each other probably just 5 years down the line, and suddenly found ourselves as Ghanaians, Togolese, Beninois. We still had enemy images of each other. We didn't know each other. We didn't like each other very much. We felt the others were actually colonizing states themselves. So let me make this point. Sometimes when we talk about colonialism, we tend to perceive only the external colonial processes and overlook the domestic colonial processes, in which more powerful ethnic groups sought to dominate and ensure, just like Portugal, Britain, and France, that the conquered states also learned to speak their language, adopt their customs, their sartorial behavior, blah, 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 blah. And herein lies what is happening also in Ethiopia. That the tensions that have come up as a result of the new regime and the resistance by the Tigranians is because a minority leadership that has governed this huge, I think the second most populous state. I think the Tigranians only form 5 to 6% of the population. Is leading to this resistance, misunderstanding, and unfortunately, this rather explosive, war that we are seeing. So the larger question becomes, how do we craft a national integration project that is inclusive, that is tolerant, that is dialogic, that has a national vision around which all the different groups cohere? The argument I am making is that ethnic diversity in itself is not a problem. It is the lack of sophisticated, nuanced, informed leadership that exploits and heightens the differences that groups have, so they can have short-term, either political or pecuniary benefits. So the heterogeneity of the youthful groups that you are talking about cuts across education, employment, ethnicity, social networks, all those things. Now, how do we harness this multiplicity of interests and backgrounds in a manner that makes people feel that we are all speaking the same language? And herein comes your great physiology about constructing this national project. When you have a large majority of a nation's population who feel excluded, then we need a new language, we need a new discourse that brings them into the center of how governance processes are implemented, how economic resources are distributed, and also the challenge that is thrown to them. One is to be young and to say, I want to be part of this process. The second is for us to ask them, well, what do you bring to the table, and what are the measuring variables that you will be subjected to when you are given that chance. Here, Africa's political leaders have failed. And I think the challenge is for them to say, look, fine, we recognize your numbers, we recognize your ambitions, we recognize your desire for inclusion. We will give you that chance. But just like anybody else, we will assess you. And we will make sure that that chance is used as properly as possible.
I would like to go back a little bit to the way we engage, and I have a question for you on that. But I mean, at the introduction, Peter stressed the interconnectedness between the Sahel and the coast, and in both ways, so to speak, and this understanding the regional dynamics, the cross-border dynamics is obviously a very big challenge, and it has been traditionally a challenge also for our instruments. And how do we actually respond to these things? Whereas we have more and more long-term experience on the national engagements we have, but then again, we also have to understand the differences within the countries and between the countries. So my question to you, I mean, we have been looking at now our way of working. We in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we now are applying doing development differently, where you have a much more holistic, much more integrated approach, and where you look at all the policies and all the instruments within a single country. But my question to you is, I mean, knowing Denmark and the way we work, what would be your recommendation to us that I can take with me and between us and the audience here to go back and say, well, there we have some suggestions on how to improve our work. I'm sorry, but
no, I think it's a very good question. Yeah. So let me sit comfortably. Yeah. No, I think I'm fairly well placed to answer this question, particularly dealing with about 12 or 15 different partners and juggling 15 different partner expectations and demands. And let me say this and say it very clearly. I think there's something about, I don't know if there's something called the Scandinavian way of doing things, but it is predicated on trust, dialogue, and reciprocal respect. That opens doors and allows for engagement in a manner that is very different sometimes when you work with other partners. In the 20 or so odd years since I left, Denmark and went back to Ghana and have worked with, the Danish state in different capacities, it is pleasant when you sit across the table from your Danish or Scandinavian partners, and there is a basic expectation that I can give you 1 million crowns, and we've agreed on this specific interventions and outcomes, and I trust that you will be assessed based on how others would have been assessed in company. It is a different ball game altogether when others will say, Christian, but you said you bought this on the account. That bottle is 10 krona, but I went out there and it is 9 krona 75 euro. So I will pay you. I'll go and buy the water from town and replace it. when partnership is predicated on suspicion and a sense that I have a here come my eye mentality, I know much more than you do, and my culture supersedes yours, then we'll listen to you very politely and dismiss you with the disrespect that you said. That relates closely to how knowledge is transferred, now widely captured as capacity building. When people come in with a perception or partners that, look, I'm not even going to listen or try to learn what you know. I've designed this project in capital X, and I'm the one who has the money. So whether you like it or not, I will implement it. If I come to you and you are creating trouble, I'll go over and above you and talk to your minister who will order you to listen to me and implement it. That does not build partnerships. You know, so I think the approach and the message is partnerships predicated on a listening ear, on respect, on building trust, and genuinely understanding where your partners are coming from and engaging them at that level helps to achieve the outcomes of what you want to implement.
But if we, for instance, look then to broaden it a bit up and also take it to the current situation in Mali, where there has been for quite a while some anti-Western sentiment and clear expressions of that, especially with regard to the military presence. But there's also been more of a broader anti-Western sentiment there. That quite positive, and thank you for that description you make of the Nordic way. Does that completely vanish and disappear in when Denmark and also other like-minded countries that engage in military operations, for instance, in Mali?
No. And let me once more make this clear. The demonstrations in Niger and in Mali and those anti-Western sentiments targeted specific countries. Both in Niger and in Cameroon, the manner in which special forces will go into a village without listening to the village headman or chief and basically describe people or groups that they engage with as extremists, terrorists, and expecting those chiefs, communities to provide information. It doesn't work that way. In 2009 and 2010, I traveled in quite a number of villages in Niger, Burkina Faso, northern Mali, Mauritania, and Nigeria. And in talking to a number of community heads, it became very clear that there was a sense of disrespect. And these are historical sense of disrespect and abuse. So those demonstrations were very targeted. Now, I realize how a small country such as Denmark will need to go into partnerships to be able sometimes to engage on the military side. But herein comes the Danish military culture and the way of doing military business. If we take, for example, French special forces, their history on the continent is one of excessive brutality. American counterterrorism operations are brutal, centered primarily on the national interest, very parochial, and seeks to determine or to achieve American interests over and above the interest of the countries and communities in which they work. Now, when you behave that way, I can assure you, that generally does not bring about trust, it doesn't deepen partnership, and it doesn't help in the exchange of information. Okay, so although you are in these huge coalitions where probably you provide one plane, a couple of military officers, the real challenge or question then becomes, how do you influence the culture within that group so that it's more predicated on the respect for the rule of law, respect for human rights, and respect or learning to listen. And this goes beyond the missions themselves. When Operation Sahel was initiated, the messages coming out of Paris were very disturbing for quite a number of people in the sub-region. Because from Paris' side, it was that the terrorists have been defeated and dispelled. And we raised the question, dispelled to where? Because when you dispel them, the end result is that they enter other countries. So also how we do the messaging of the partnerships, the interventions, and the ultimate outcomes also plays a very critical role. Finally, is that we need always to be conscious of history. Some of these communities have really long historical memories. And there are occasions when these historical memories and experiences can be misinterpreted and also exploited to create these anti-Western sentiments.
I think maybe we should move on to the questions from the audience, unless you have.
Well, I will not. I have plenty.
Okay, so,
but I have
maybe
one that I would like to pose, and that is maybe the final, and it is again related to this interconnectedness between the Sahel and the coastal countries. Is there already, according to your research and insights, a collusion between the terrorists, the organized crime, and the illicit trafficking, going all the way out to the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea?
No, I think there's a positive correlation. Collusion also relates somehow to levels at which people who are located within the interstices of the state use the state as a vehicle to provide facilities, passports, banking systems, transportation, storage for these criminal enterprises to become very successful. So if you take the 2010 arrest of supposedly 3 drug dealers, massive drug dealers in Ghana, who were actually terrorists who had brought drugs from Colombia and were passing it through Ghana, until the Ghanaian government, arrested them for narcotics trafficking, and during interrogation found out that they were actually terrorists, and I think they were renditioned to wherever. But it raises questions as to how they were able to pass through the port, how they were able to store all these goods. So yes, there's a certain interconnectedness. But finally, Peter, probably let me say something in 30 seconds about this interconnectedness, not just about levels of collusion between criminal enterprises and those who are within the interstices of the state. The interconnectedness is also related, Christian, to the trade routes. We tend to think that from Kidal to Abidjan is very far. But if Peter places on this screen the trans-Saharan trade routes, and then we superimpose the different routes over time, and then place the modern boundaries of the Sahelian and West African states on it, you actually see that the routes being used presently by so-called terrorists, organized criminals, human traffickers are not different from what was used during the trans-Saharan trade. So those interconnectedness based on the trade routes, based on family, based on economic links, based on social links, are actually getting stronger as states' capacity and ability to deliver social service or social welfare goods also gets weaker and weaker.
So thank you very much, both of you. I think now is the time for, we're a little bit over time, but let's take some questions from the audience. And we have 8 questions and probably more will come in. But I think Mikael Jor, I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name, but I think he's asking a very basic question, sort of like relates to a lot of what you've been talking about. He calls it a provocative question, but he's asking, are all West African countries ready for democracy? And that's obviously a very general question. So if the question is no, then what are the consequences, both for the support that should be coming from outside and how it's looked upon from the countries that are receiving it? But maybe that first question, I think we've had these conversations, not with that particular question in mind, but sort of the dynamics in these places. Is there actually, what is, not to militarize our language, but what is militating against sort of democratic developments in the countries? Or, as you said, all African leaders are democratically elected at this point in time. So what does that actually mean, sort of on the ground, practically for people?
Well, I mean, it's a contestation. You know, it will take time as we develop the institutions, as people begin to understand what it means to be able to have free speech, but to do that speech within certain limits. You know, you can't just use abusive, threatening language. So if one looks at where West Africa was, even 10 years ago, and where the countries are now, there is some progress. Democratic institutions are still weak. Parliament's role can be improved. Its oversight functions can be improved. You know, but I think there's an incremental progress.
Yeah.
But precisely because these democratic processes are juxtaposed against much more developed, much more established democracies, then of course the weaknesses, the failures are always in sharp relief. But I am an eternal optimist. So yes, I mean, there are differences and difficulties, but I think.
And I think this is also an important question in what we're discussing here, because there is, of course, a tendency to focus very much on the challenges. And frankly, sometimes when we talk about West Africa, you have a sense that the region is collapsing constantly. And I think it's just important also to have a little bit of a historical perspective on this so-called collapse, because there are developments within the countries that are also a strong bulwark against sort of this collapse that we also need to focus on, because there needs to be some sort of, you know, narrative that is also becoming dominant more, that is not about terrorism, extremism, climate change, demographics, although these are extremely big and very, very important questions obviously for all of us. So I think actually, I'm happy that you just said that, because there are changes in the region, of course, as well. Christian.
Maybe just a comment from a specific situation in Burkina Faso, which is with the elections on Sunday, the what could be the final, but also at least the first round. That we see there a 17% increase of registered voters compared to last time, even under very difficult circumstances in the country. That means that 2/3 of the the vote space is actually registered now. On the other hand, you have 1,600 villages that have not been able to be registered because of the security situation. You also have about 1 million of IDPs that you try to accommodate where they can vote where they are. And for the presidential election, that's fine. But then it poses a challenges for the parliamentary elections. Also in Burkina Faso, the possibility for their diaspora to actually vote. That's also a new facility, in many ways a positive one. Although what the numbers we have is that it's only 1/10 of, or even 1%, I think it is actually, of the Burkinabe population outside Burkina Faso. It's 2.5 million, and it's only about 23,000 that have actually registered. But just to say, it is a general positive situation as far as we see it.
But let me make a point about this democracy. Democracies also function best when there's an almost independent private sector part to the population. And I think in West Africa, even with all the difficulties and challenges, we are seeing a net positive return of diasporans who are investing their savings in small, businesses. When you have an expanding middle class in which people have invested in creating businesses, they also have an interest in ensuring state stability. They have an interest in ensuring that they will contribute to how policy is developed and implemented. But I like your point, Peter, that precisely because these challenges are so overwhelming, we tend to overlook these small positive steps that are critical, part of the building blocks to strengthening the state, and then certainly also strengthening the democratic processes.
And I also think that crisis grabs attention. So when we are having these conversations, there will be more, you will get attention if you talk about the crisis and the collapse, rather than a middle class that is actually starting to stabilize countries. So I think that's also an important part of how global politics and the collaboration between global South and North is working. There is a question, and there's one of the participants is saying, good example from elections in Burkina. So that's good. Let me just see here. It's from Finn. It's a little bit difficult to control. Okay. Yes. 1 second. I just need to find it again. Because he would like to hear more about whether you could assess the African peace and security architecture and how it's working. As we saw ECOWAS being quite effective in relation to the Gambia some years ago, but in many other examples not so effective. For instance, in Mali, ECOWAS only reacted after the coup d'etat. But we also, I think, have discussed quite at length. So I think that is a very interesting point in terms of specifically the architecture, but also ECOWAS and the role that it can play. And also, if you could talk about that, the both of you, how is support given and how is support best given to an organization like ECOWAS? Small questions. If you can just quickly.
Okay,
please.
I think the questions about the African peace and security architecture and ECOWAS are really very important. But I want to sort of elevate it to a much more sort of philosophical or theoretical level and relate it to norm development. How do institutions build and develop norms in which its member states voluntarily agree to uphold those norms? You see, an institution is only as strong as its component parts allows it to be. So when we take the APSA, for example, it struggled consistently when Bashir was in power in Sudan to criticize Bashir and to hold him accountable. The APSA, and particularly the Peace and Security Council, will find it extremely difficult to criticize Ethiopia. Although we know now that there are some human rights, atrocities, refugees are crossing the border, and it's the same with ECOWAS when it comes to Nigeria.
Yeah.
And I think part of the larger question relates to what these institutions can do, or the extent to which they can elicit compliance from their larger more powerful member states. So it's fairly straightforward and easy to manipulate a small country like Gambia.
Yeah.
But even more so when there's a despicable head of state, Jame, a rapist, a thief, a burglar, and a basic crook, a murderer. It's difficult to get people to come around the table and say, this guy must be booted out. Okay. Mali was difficult for ECOWAS, similar to La Côte d'Ivoire, because of the role of France. If you remember, in Mali, ECOWAS actually made a first step prior to the subsequent interventions. So the role of some of these powers that we discussed much earlier on and how their actions generate this anti-Western sentiments also plays a role. How best do we support these institutions, Peter? And what forms of institutional support do they need? Let me say this. Quite a lot of the challenges faced by these two institutions is that they have become an extension of their constituent member states. That it is not Africa's best and brightest who are normally sent there.
You said it.
Why, there's something wrong in saying that?
No.
Good. So the EU had a capacity building project that sought to actually scout the continent and nominate and select some of the sharpest minds to go to the EU. And across board, probably less than 5% of those who were recruited have stayed, because there was an institutional culture that was extremely conservative and did not allow thinking outside the box. So the support has been conferences, so-called capacity building, not the type of support that really transforms these institutions into the engines for change and for holding member states accountable and then for holding them to be compliant with what they have signed on to. We need to design and devise yet another way. I mean, I don't really, sitting here right now, know what we can do truly.
No. It's fair.
Yes.
Question?
I think it's a good question, and obviously now with Mali we have really had ECOWAS much involved, and it has been one of the dilemmas that we are facing, because as you were saying, Kwesi, up to the coup, I mean, it was clear that they were not willing to go in the direction that what looked like the majority of the Malians wanted, and that they had to protect the government to protect themselves.
Yeah.
That is the situation, I think, always in those kind of organizations. But after the coup, I mean, it has been an important reference for the international community to actually support and work with ECOWAS in terms of the sanctions first, and then lifting the sanctions afterwards. And again, it's a cliche, but I mean, it does have some sense that you say the African solutions to African problems. So it's difficult for me to see that we have a lot of alternatives for this, and then it is about how do we best support them to be stronger institutions, both politically and institutionally. And then again, I think if it is not the subject for this dialogue, but if you look at our own organizations here in Europe, we also struggle with finding consensus on these quite sensitive issues. So I think we have to,
no, I think,
to keep
let
that in
me
mind.
come back to a point that Christian has just made, which I think gives us an opening as to what we can, how we can support. I think in Mali, there was a mediation team. I mean, one of ECOWAS's strong points has been, putting in place an ECOWAS mediation team, routinely led by a former head of state. So probably supporting ECOWAS to, and also the AU, to establish some standing multiple mediation teams who can be sent out very quickly when the early warning structures identify that there is a problem of sort. The panel of the wise, I don't think has been very effective, both in ECOWAS and the African Union. But if we are to look for the preventive side, then I guess using some of these mediation teams might be the way to go.
Your description of Jonathan Goodluck last time we spoke was not enormously positive, but he, I mean, he did play a role.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it did send quite an unfortunate, signal that when you become a former head of state, all your sins are washed away and it becomes as white as snow. This is one of the most famous religious songs in Africa, sung every Sunday. Although people have never seen snow before and they don't know how cold it is.
True.
I think we also have a very sort of like straightforward question here. How do we ensure that the bulging youthful population feel included in the sharing of resources? And I think the reason why I'm asking this is because this is probably one of the biggest, let me use another horrible word, bombs under many of the West African countries. We're seeing Nigeria right now, which very much is about a big group of young people feeling left out. RUF, Revolutionary United Front in Sierra Leone, was set up in a university. There was a war in Sierra Leone for 10 years during the 1990s. And we see it across the region, and something that obviously is discussed in relation to conflicts. So maybe the first question, how big of a threat do you see this to be for West Africa, and what, not what is needed, I think we know a little bit, you can say a little bit about that. Is it even possible that this big group can be accommodated in the short to medium term?
We don't have a choice.
No, I know.
Accommodate them, not even in the medium term, but in the immediate short term.
Yeah.
And I think for those who remember their figures, if you take, say, Ghana and Denmark, and I mean, Ghana is not the worst case in this example, like around 1951 or so, Ghana and Denmark, or Ghana had a slightly higher population than Denmark. Ghana's population has increased probably 800% over the last 63 years. And that gives you the scale of the challenges that we are looking at. If you then compare it to Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Senegal. So this is a growing and an ever expanding problem on a weekly basis and on a monthly basis. The positive thing, however, unlike some of the other challenges that I mentioned earlier on, is that heads of states are very aware. Actually, I think they call it a ticking bomb. They are very aware that the teeming, youth would have to be brought in somehow, jobs, education, housing, and be given some hope. So that recognition is very useful for now. As to what specific interventions can be made, first to give the youth a sense of inclusiveness. That is a topic for another discussion. But an even more sensitive topic is what do we do to ensure that these numbers don't get out of hand?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, no, and I think it is both a very short-term and immediate challenge, and it's a medium and long-term challenge we have at hand, or the West African countries have. And I think if it's possible, and that's where a lot of support is going to strengthen and increase the political inclusion, so that at least a large part of the youth population feels that it is part of the project of the countries, and that their interests are taken into consideration. I think that's a big challenge already, but that's what we are working at. The economic challenge is, and employment is just enormous, and there it's maybe even more difficult in some of the countries to see how it will be possible to absorb or even have, if we put it that way, a labor market which is able to take this in, which then creates frustration. It makes people move away, and it is within the African country, and it's also the regular migration towards Europe.
Yeah.
So how to approach this in many ways. I mean, we have to provide social services for those who are there now. And with this increase, I mean, the amount of teachers, the amount of schools that have to be built, the amount of nurses and so on is just enormous. And all the countries are trailing with regard to this. And then the other one, which is a very sensitive issue, is how do we bring down the fertility rate? There are some signs, and we also see that the dialogue is more open now with our partner countries. There are also differences between the countries, but this is happening. But that will take a long time. Yeah. Bringing down 7 children per woman in Niger to something which is much more manageable is a long haul. And there you go into the cultural, the religious issues, and so on, and the social fabric, which is a very, very complicated and difficult issue.
No, I mean, this is a problem that in Ghana we have faced from the late 1960s, when our Prime Minister, our late Prime Minister, Kuzia, thought that from the assessment of the National Statistical Services that the projections were way too high, and had sought to launch a program focusing on women and birth control. And I can assure you, songs were made about him. He was ridiculed. His wife was made fun of. And then the basic message was that don't trust this guy because he's successful, his children are educated, he wants he and his family to continue to govern Ghana. So this positive message was twisted and presented negatively. And the end result, almost 40 years later, is a population that has increased probably by 500-600%. So the way that the messaging is framed and couched to different segments of the population will become very, very critical. But we can't delay in framing that message anymore.
So, gentlemen, I want to thank you two for sitting here on this stage and talking to people online that have been watching, hopefully, and enjoying this conversation. I also just want to briefly say that this conversation that we've had about the threat challenges in West Africa are being turned into a report as well that will come out early next year, and that is Christian, unfortunately, is not part of writing it, but it's been one of the reasons why Kwesi has visited us here at DIIS for the last 3 months. So this is also a chance to say thank you very much, Kwesi, for coming and staying here at DIIS with us. It's been a true pleasure, and we look forward to presenting our work to you early next year. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, Christian.